Yes.
This is one of my study areas. This is just looking from the very north end of Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic up to the next island. So we're looking at probably about 80 degrees north. And that's all sea ice, the flat white ahead of you. So in the summer, I go through on a ship as you actually get to sail through the water. And then in the winter, I'm up there with my Inuit colleagues and we stand on the ocean.
It's beautiful. Michaela, I believe it's recording. It didn't give us the nice little, this message is being recorded, but it says it's recording. I've got the little cloud that's flashing and.
Yeah, it looks like it's running.
Okay, cool. Okay, we'll wait one more minute, then we'll get started.
Good to see you, Lynn.
Yeah. Bonjour. I was just going to say I saw it in the window there. How are you, sir?
Okay, it's 3:02. I'd like to get started. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this version of the UNN NMSU speaker series on Geography Colloquium. My name is Christopher Brown. I'm the speaker series director from NMSU, and I'm confessing to not knowing who the speaker series coordinator is at UNM, but I'll guess it's Maria Lane, who was unable to be with us today. It's also my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lynn Moorman. Lynn is a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Mount Royal University, and she is also governor of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, a very prestigious role. Lynn has a background in physical geography, specifically remote sensing and GIS. She also has extensive training in the field of education, which makes her kind of a friend and sibling to Mike in an intellectual sense, because Mike Demers's background is also in that area. And I would like to give a special thank you to Mike for getting us connected with Lynn and helping us bring her here, if only in a virtual sense. Lynn's academic research pulls from both education and geography, looking at geospatial literacy and technology use, learner requirements, and the practice of geographic education. In her talk, Lynn will explore how learner requirements for digital Earth are being determined through eye tracking research. And I think that's typed properly. It could say eye catching research. I think it really is eye tracking research. And Lynn will clarify that in her talk. She's looking to reveal how data collection tools engage the public in geography, education, and citizen science. Specific areas of the globe where she's worked. As we know from the Arctic, we just looked over her shoulder. She's also examined mapping rogue turkeys in Calgary's urban core and looking at critical ice hazard mapping with her Inuit colleagues in the Arctic. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to Lynn. And Lynn, thank you for coming. I look forward to your talk. I shall step down, but I'm here if you need me.
Great. Thank you so much, Christopher. I really appreciate the introduction and I appreciate being invited, and I really wish I was there in person, but I'm going to hold you to, that invitation. I will come down sometime. I'm going to talk about a lot of different things. We talk about GIS and remote sensing. There's a lot of things there. When we talk about how that enters into the education field, there's a lot of aspects there. And then, as Christopher mentioned in the introduction, I want to talk about like the cognition and what's important to understand about the learner requirements to use these tools effectively. I find when I go into schools or into communities, or even in my own remote sensing GIS classrooms, there's a lot of assumptions we make around what people actually understand. And, we give them these kind of black boxes and it's pretty intuitive to figure out where you are, but is it really? And I always question that. And so my research has really delved into what do we truly understand and what are the pedagogical implications? How can we make things easier, better, more effective for learners? So you'll see some of that. You'll see some rogue turkeys. I'm going to ask someone to give me kind of a heads up at 10 minutes or so, because I don't want to keep people on past our allotted time. And I know,
Okay, I'm going to set a phone alarm, and when it goes off, we'll know.
yeah, okay,
Okay, thank you.
that's perfect. Thank you very much. So let's get down to some business here. So where I am from is Calgary, Alberta, but it's also the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, Tsuut'ina, Erie Nakota, and also the home of Métis Nation. And the Indigenous peoples called Calgary, where I'm at, Mohkinstsis, and it is where the Elbow River meets the Bow. And really amazing geography here. We're at where the prairies meet the mountains, and we've got beautiful foothills. It's just a physical geographer's paradise, and that was my first introduction to geography, was really understanding the land around me. And I thought, why wouldn't anybody want to know all of this? And so I felt geography was kind of the route to go. Not many jobs in physical geography when I finished up, so I ended up at the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing in Ottawa, and really built up my remote sensing GIS background there. Any good geographer would show where they are on the map, of course. That's where I am. It is snow covered now. It actually looks more like what's behind me. So I thought this might cool you down if it's a little bit warm where you are. You may have seen Canada represented some way like this. This is what I really like to explore, is right from the start. How are we understanding representations of the Earth? And what do we know about children's cognitive development that then plays into understanding maps, representations? How does that feed into our adult learning as well? It is a continuum, and everyone's on a little different space. And then when we start to bring in technology, digital technologies, it's different than looking at print maps and print representations. So I like to explore that as well. Just in terms of where some of my experience is coming from, Christopher mentioned I'm a governor in the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and I've been on the education committee there for over a decade, and we have 22,000 educators in our midst. It's not to say geography education is great here. It's very piecemeal. There's a lot that needs to be done and can be done. So again, this work seems to never be done, which is good for a researcher, I guess. Also with RCGS, I became involved with a company that does expeditions in the Arctic, and they just kind of needed someone to translate what they were seeing in the outside world to the passengers on board, and how geography might relate to archaeology, how geography might relate to the geology, how it might relate to the animals that we're seeing in the marine life. So it's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. And so I spend usually a month on the ship each year. And this next year we're hoping we'll be doing Iceland, and then Iceland to Greenland. So and some of my students along the way. Of course, I also bring a map, being a good geographer, but I bring floor maps. And this accidentally served as a way of doing yoga as well, because the text is actually quite small on the floor maps if you've ever tried to look at them. And so there's a lot of bending over, and eventually everybody ends up on the floor, and it is a form of yoga. But I find this really important to know where you are. And when we're on the ship, we don't have any connectivity. So it's a really fun way to engage people and begin to show them, their route. They can follow their route on the map. In the past, we would carry these heavy things around and collect street view data for Google as well. I don't know if you've ever worn these, but these are really, really heavy cameras. I was wearing one in northern Labrador, where there are no roads, of course, and Labrador is on the far northeast coast of Canada. And there are no roads, so we were hiking carrying these, and I was walking beside the Google fellow, and I guess he was carrying it, and I took a little shortcut over a stream that everyone told me not to take, and tripped, turtled on my back, and thought, well, at least nobody's there to see it, except everybody who's ever looked at that area on Google Earth, because of course it's on Street View. I want to talk just about what I think of in terms of the power of geography. I actually, have borrowed these from Esri. They've always got the fight for spatial awareness, and I tend to personalize the magnificent map girl and kind of the queen of GIS, because I do think GIS is one of our tools to speak geography and to visualize geography, and really important in schools and in education. Some areas really value it, right? Different countries in the world are really picking up on the importance of GIS as just critical in terms of a regular mainstream information service. And, I think Canada and the US, again, pockets of strength, but there's still a lot of work we can do. But I really find that there's two different sort of powers that can bring. One is the spatial vision, right? So we see what others can't. And Jack Dangerman has been saying that a lot, but I've been saying this for a long, long time too, in terms of seeing different wavelengths of energy, and we see patterns and trends, and we have that spatial perspective. And something very important for education is that it allows us to see a geocentric perspective and not egocentric. This really ties to development, especially in children, their cognitive development, as they start to finally really truly understand another perspective where it isn't always about you, or if you're telling directions. Hopefully you do the same. If I ask you directions someplace, you don't always just say right or left. That's very personal, right? But if we're thinking geographically and geocentric, we have east and west. We can use our directions. There was a tribe in California called the Wintu tribe, and they didn't have left and right arms. They would have an east arm or a west arm, right? So depending which way you're facing, your arm might be east arm or it might be a west arm. So really good spatial thinking there. The other thing is, the other power is actually, I think, our power tools. And these are the digital technologies. So our tools of geography have always been things like globes and maps, but the power tools, that's what the digital technology provides now. If you look at the word technology, and techne means crafting or creating something. How do you create something? And really it extends, we can create and extend our human abilities. So things like the virtual globes, even Null Earth, I don't know if you use that for teaching. I find that one fabulous. It shows anything from air current patterns and sea current patterns and temperatures, and really, really useful to things like Google Earth. And then of course, GIS, and with GIS is everything now from all the data collection apps and tech. I can barely keep up. I just saw another announcement from Esri about, consolidating all the field apps. And I think I'm almost old enough now where I'm about, I can't learn anymore, but I'll keep going for a while longer. So remote sensing, of course, as well. And then where things are really heating up is the digital Earth and virtual reality. I don't think either of these are fads for geography or for education. And I want to speak to a few different initiatives that I've been involved with those. Digital Earth, of course, is really just looking at the accessibility of a virtual globe, but having the power and that analytic capability of a GIS. And as geographers, you must always use these powers for good. So luckily, there's been a lot of research on spatial thinking over the last decade. Seminal publication came out about 2006. And we learn a lot about that from psychology, but it's also been this revolution in the science of learning that helps us kind of understand and be able to dig deep in terms of how are people thinking, geographically, spatially. How are they going to think differently depending on what kind of medium they're looking at? So we know it's an 8, but we also know that there's different levels, novice to expert, and they can be learned, they can be improved. Very important in terms of STEM disciplines as well. The research is ongoing, and every year we see yet another kind of publication that really reinforces that idea. And that's really important for education. The curriculum always reflects what society values, and I think there's been a lot of times where geography is seen as, oh, you get to know more about your world. But if we really dig down and go, yeah, but you can improve, your math, you can improve visualization. That would be great for chemistry or engineering, all through practicing of geography. That's really important to affect the policy makers. It's difficult to extend to other domains, but that there's elements like mental rotation. If you're rotating maps and trying to interpret them differently, if you're using digital globes and seeing different perspectives, all of that serves to strengthen the hippocampus, and that ends up having some pretty good effects for other disciplines. We can also see that it can be affected, right? It can be affected by disease. I had chemo quite a few years ago, and it was really, really harsh. And I'd say I had some pretty big effects from it. But the thing that bothered me the most was that I completely lost my spatial thinking. And being a geographer, and I'm an excellent navigator typically, and all of a sudden I would be on a road and I would have no idea which way to turn to get to where I needed to go. I've noticed that there's a call for doing some research around Alzheimer's with spatial thinking, and I think there's a lot that can be done for people who've gone through other medical conditions too. So here's a couple of things just around the kids that I want you to notice, because this plays into how we understand just basic imagery and things like Google Earth. So we got a little fellow here doing some little geo inquiry. At his age, he's probably around 7 or 8. So at that point, just moving from that egocentric perspective to geographic perspective. The other thing is that nadir perspective, right? And if you're looking at air photos, or if someone's looking at Google Earth, they can find their home, and people tend to search for home. But with kids, there is actually a little more complexity to it, because they are just building that nadir perspective, and we don't really practice it. If you think about literacy in terms of reading and writing and how much we practice, that the reading and understanding for the reading, with geography, we don't tend to go back, right, and reinforce those things and check in on those things. So kids will often view things from an oblique perspective and then gradually go to nadir, and they'll switch different elements. So if you take a look at the map on the upper right, you can see the roads are a great nadir view, right? You've got the intersections, you can see the lines in the roads, but then any of the houses, they haven't quite figured out how to do that top down yet. And you'll see this in Google Earth if you're trying to get kids to use it, maybe even older kids as well. They tend to really go for Street View, and Street View provides that oblique, more realistic look. And that tends to be why. And I've actually never met a kid who doesn't try to sneak out of the nadir view and sneak into Street View to take a look. This gets me into a whole other geoliteracy lecture that we can do someday, but I do think it's really, really critical for geographers to understand what their own literacy is. If you think about, you might have heard of National Geographic's definition. It's the ability to use geographic understanding and reasoning to make decisions. I don't go with that. I go to the actual literacy literacy frameworks and the academic work around literacy. And it's all about its representation, right? A text is symbols, and how do you read those symbols to make information? And then how do you get that information back, right? So it's about sharing and communicating information through representation. So when I look at some of these big international educational assessment programs. So the PISA, IELTS, Canadian Council on Learning has the same kind of thing. There's actually one of the things that they look at is map and image reading. And then ironically, the way they portray the information is on a map, but in Canada, at least, most people in Canada don't have the literacy to be able to read the map about how non-literate they are. So there's a lot of work to be done along that too. One thing around spatial thinking is that it can be very, very reciprocal. And what I mean by that is if we take take what we know and look into some, I'm gonna keep using Google Earth as an example, but it could be any, any imagery, any digital imagery. Looking at that, we start to build on what we already know to ask questions. And that usually helps investigate more into the imagery, and you can actually start to learn from that, which you bring back to your own core of spatial thinking. And it just tends to build and build and build. There's some really good literature on this, particularly in the psychology field. So David Utall has done some really great work on this. So what's changing from those tools of geography to the power tools? Well, we've got the mode, right? We're going from a map, which is a cartographic expression and single authored, to an image, which is more photographic. We've got different media. We've got a static media to very dynamic, movable. You can change your perspective. The authorship is different. So all of this really aligns with how just learning in general has changed over the last few decades. Even the direction of information flow, we can put our own information on the map. So in some of my forensics around how students actually extract information from Google Earth and ingest it and take it in and make sense of it, one thing that I found was the use of abductive reasoning. So this is not deductive or inductive. Abductive is pretty much what I was just describing, where you take what you know and you're looking at this image and there's a question, you're trying to understand something. And the best way of doing that, especially with an image, is to make an interpretation. You interpret and then start looking for things that will either validate that interpretation or nullify that interpretation, and then keep going from that. And so I've got recordings of kids that they figure out what something is, and then they argue with themselves and go, no, it can't be that. And then they come up with a new idea. And it was just a fabulous example of abductive reasoning. A lot of student agency, right? They are actually being able to control where they're looking. It's a very different experience than the static maps. And the things where that's really important is in really building mental models of the world. We've got a lot of understanding of how if you look at a Mercator map for all of your childhood in your classroom, that's the image you're going to have of the world. And there are people in the world, and sadly I've seen them, where they don't understand you can fly around the world. So we had one person wanting to go from Canada to Australia and could only figure out one way. You could only fly one way because the other way you'd go off the map, and just couldn't build a strong mental map of the world from that. So the more different types of representations we have, the more variety, the more robust those mental models are of Earth. And that can only be a good thing when we're trying to look at, global relationships and how do we fit with other economies and other places. So that change in representation, the ability to move in and out, changing scale, also really critical. What we find with strong spatial thinkers is that they really use a zoom feature. So if they are looking around and then get a little bit lost, they'll actually come out right away, change their scale, get a broader overview, and then zoom back into the next thing. Whereas the lower spatial thinkers are panning and panning and panning. So the next time you're looking for something on Google Earth or any GIS, see if you're panning or if you're actually zooming in and out. A couple of things that I found in my research that were real challenges around image interpretation for students. One was, so the nadir effect, absolutely, still an issue, and far more so than the educators, the teachers ever thought was a problem for the kids. Another was dimensionality. So understanding that you're actually seeing a 2D image draped on a terrain model. And hence why you see the stream sometimes up partway on a valley side as opposed to the very bottom of the valleys, because the digital elevation model is not quite aligned with the imagery, or you just have kind of incongruent resolution there. So that was a big issue. What that meant was if there were any clouds in the imagery, that people would tend to see them as part of the landscape, not realizing that there was this gap between clouds, air, earth, and then that image draped over. So some of the research, and this has been done in museums for visualizations as well as in schools, is that people would think clouds are glaciers because they see them on the landscape. So as part of this forensics, I went and worked with a digital earth software company. And what they wanted to do was make it as easy to use as Google Earth, and then have really like natural language queries. So you didn't have to learn all of the, the Esri way of understanding the tools and the vernacular, which is very tough for students. Many students don't know what proximity means in the ArcGIS online world. So I was working with them to try and get that natural language and understand how students would actually use the software. So this is the eye tracking. It might be appealing as well, or I can't remember the word you used, Christopher, there. But here's the eye tracking. So the way it works is up in the left corner, you actually see the student, and then you see the pupils, and you can see the light going into the pupils. And there's just a little device that I put on the base of the screen, either the laptop screen or a monitor. And that is an active sensor, so it's actually sending out light and then measuring how it's reflecting in the eyes to where the student's looking. So what we can do is actually get a map of the students looking at the map. Two things that are really, really important here. One is we want to look at the attention time. So that indicates that a student is trying to figure something out, right? There's something that's caught their attention, and typically it's when there's something they're not understanding. So they're looking at it and trying to figure it out. So in this case, this was a great example of someone actually looking at the legend. You don't get many of those. This eye tracking can be a great tool for trying to assess how people are looking at maps as well, right? So do they ever look at the legend? I think most of the time my students don't, but this would be proof of that, of course. So this is a heat map just showing how long people are looking at a certain feature. The other thing we can do is kind of track the directions of movements and how long they stay at any spot. So I'm just going to see if this little video will work here. There we go. So this is really fun when you do a change detection, two different images, and you see them just going back and forth and seeing what they're seeing and what they're not being able to see. I use this with my Inuit participants in the Arctic, learning radar imagery, so I can see if they're picking up on the features that they actually need to pay attention to on the sea ice. Now there's a girl speaking on this. She's a grade 11 Australian student, so I did this work in Australia. And we're looking at areas that are really familiar to them on a digital earth and areas that aren't as familiar, and getting them to interpret the data from them, because it's quite a bit different if it's an area they don't know versus if it's an area they do know. They make a lot of assumptions for areas they know. So I'm going to play this. She's going to speak, but I don't think you'll hear the words very well, so I'm going to kind of translate. So a grade 11 Australian girl looking at North America. So she doesn't know what this is. So she doesn't really know it. And you can tell from the eye tracking, she's kind of looking everywhere. She's looking for a title. She's looking for something that'll give her a bit of a clue. So I've asked her to start rotating the world so she can have a better, maybe find something a little more familiar. Yeah. So now she knows where she is. She thinks. And then she just said, "Is that home on its side?" So she's recognized home. Yeah. So that's another. Oh, let's see if I can get the next screen. There we go. So that's another thing with students is that whole north is up, that orientation, it's absolutely fixed in mental maps. And that's something that we have to change just to build that understanding that, you can look at something a different direction, a different way, and build that flexibility of the mind to understand different shapes and recognize them. If we've done studies where we've shown university students, our province upside down, and they don't have a clue what it is. So there's a whole other research area on that as well. So Google, I just want to mention a couple of different technologies. Google Earth is really good for actually, kind of creating some of those mapping ideas, understanding point, line, polygon, constructing routes. I really like it for thinking in 3 or 4 dimensions and that whole interpretation idea. I use it, of course, for field trip context for my own organization, but also to kind of situate everybody. And I do that in GIS as well. Another big thing is everybody has a spatial story. And so getting people to talk about their spotobiographies, and that's how I introduce students in class at the beginning of each term is, and that way I test to see whether they can run all the technology as well. And they find a place and they do a little tour and they tell us about some place that's very special to them. And so we get this really these personal stories right up front, and it makes a really wonderful classroom environment actually. So it's kind of, it's not biogeography, it's geobiography, I think. ArcGIS Online, a lot of schools, a lot of institutions are using that now. Key thing is, being able to map existing data or authoring and creating their own data. And this is going to be really important when we start talking about mobile devices too, and people creating maps. It really helps bring in the open data, authoritative content, and authentic learning is very, very important in education now. So this really aligns with that. And the other thing is being collaborative. So students working together, of course, that's a huge benefit, and being able to see each other on the map. But the key point I always make about all of this is the map is just the beginning. Now you guys are geographers, so you know this, right? But so many people don't, where they think, oh, we've put everything on the map, it's done. And it's not, right? The map is like building the diving board, and that just allows you to launch off and go deep into the pool of more questions and more analyses. So I always say never stop with the map. The map is just the beginning. Now, so I've talked a lot about digital, but the physicalizations now are also really important because we kind of need this bridge, right? We went from print tools to these digital power tools, and there's a whole new way of learning and understanding those things that we haven't really adapted the pedagogy. If you look at school curriculum, and I'd say almost anywhere, the outcomes for students in terms of knowing how to make a map and reading a map and those kind of things are all really based on print, and they're not taking into account the difference that the mode of digital makes. So we kind of need a bridge there in terms of pedagogy. And this is something that I've been working with the University of Calgary computer science team with. They are big into doing physicalizations and visualizations of geodata. So these are tiles of, one is Australia and one is Western Canada. They act like an analog GIS. So you've got the base layer. Each of these are curved exactly to the Earth. So each piece has its own special curvature, and they fit together only in a certain way. And so it's different for each kind of area of the Earth as well. For education, we actually don't need that preciseness, right? We just don't need, it just makes it harder to put a model together. So my research in here was like, how are students using this, and does it help in their learning, and does it help bridge to learning about GIS? This is an example of how it works. So we've got our tile, or one of those base tiles. Typically I put the elevation data or relief data on the base as a black and white image, and then you can actually put transparent layers over top. So yeah, voila, analog GIS. What I found in my research was the students really appreciated that it was curved, that it was more true to earth than kind of maps were. The other thing they didn't get, I had where they would look at they would have to map out the area on the tiles and compare that to a map. And, maybe on the map it's square, or it's not square on the map, but it might be square on the tiles. They could not figure out why there would be a difference. So this whole thing of projections, and that each representation has different distortions of the Earth's surface, they did not get. And overwhelmingly, like 90% didn't get it. The students I worked with here were from about grade 8 to grade 11, and they all take geography classes. So it's something that wouldn't be completely new to them. Now this physicalizations, I want to bring it into the Arctic, because I really want to speak to the community that I'm working with there and the power of GIS and remote sensing. With climate change being amplified in the Arctic, there are huge issues. And of course, there's increased vegetation, and insects are coming into places where I've never seen insects before, and that's not a good thing. Local water supplies as well. Of course, transportation and culture, and where that's really critical is in the sea ice. And we often think, you see the maps about the sea ice extent and how it's changing and diminishing. But what's really important is the thickness, and we don't really get a good sense of that. We don't really see the maps of that. In one community in 2010 in Labrador, where one of the places I work, there was 14 community members who fell through the ice that year, the sea ice, because with all of the knowledge they have and all the ability to understand the features and the character of the sea ice, they can't keep up with the rapid changing. It's not aligning and fitting with what they know. And so it's making for very dangerous conditions. So I am working with a social enterprise called Smart Ice, and it's really about integrating technology with Inuit sea ice knowledge and values as well, and to help make them more resilient to climate change. So here's a couple of examples. This is our point data. These are smart buoys. They're made to go into the sea ice, and they measure the thickness of the sea ice, just based on conductivity. So they can tell where the water boundary is, and they can tell where the snow ice boundary is as well. And so the data is just uploaded through satellite, and then we actually have an Inuit version of Facebook that's pretty private for Inuit communities, and that data goes on that. So it's social media to help spread the information. And there's an Inuit youth cohort who are actually making those buoys up in northern Canada. And this is a rare thing as well. Typically things are made in the south, shipped north. So this is a really important initiative. We also use the traditional komatiks, or the sleds, the Inuit sleds. And we've got basically a ice penetrating radar on here. Gives us the thickness of the ice. So the Inuit will go on their hunting trips, or just traveling, or just monitoring the sea ice, and make tracks and come back and bring that into ArcGIS and show what the thickness of the ice is at different spots. You can see there's a monitor at the front of the Skidoo there too. It's actually giving real-time data, so they can tell when they're getting to ice that's too thin, and they'll turn around. So our whole idea is that's great line data. We've got point data and line data. Let's get all the aerial coverage. So now we're looking at remote sensing terms of satellite imagery, and getting Inuit to understand and interpret particularly radar data, and then bring that into ArcGIS, and then they're creating their own ice safety maps for their community in Inuktitut, and offering those as often as they need to based on the changing ice conditions. Middle of winter, it's not changing much, but right now the sea ice is actually coming in and building, and in May, June is when the sea ice breaks up. So radar is really important because, of course, you have a lot of darkness in the north. Right now, it's very dark in this particular place. And this is just in the north end of Baffin Island, and that's the view that's right behind me as well. So we need radar because it's an active sensor, and it also is very sensitive to surface roughness and texture, so we can tell the difference between that smooth ice and first-year ice and the rougher multi-year ice, which can cause problems, and also the pressure ridges in the ice as well. So we need to do a lot of ground truthing, of course, and my role here is really building the whole remote sensing curriculum and then the GIS curriculum, and then incorporating all of the Inuit values and learning styles and preferences in the instructional design. So I've got a team of Inuit that I work with on this. And the big thing is that we have to be, first of all, doing it in their language. So there's a lot of translation learning on my end that needs to happen. Is learning in every direction, really, for these. The other thing is around, how do you teach remote sensing? I've taught remote sensing for years and years in different places in different ways, and I still wasn't quite prepared for teaching up there. We need a lot of active learning. Putting anything on a PowerPoint, putting anything on a computer monitor, it doesn't work well. So my whole role is coming up with the most creative, engaging activities to learn remote sensing, and particularly, how does radar interact with the ice and how does that look on an image, and then make GIS really fun to do. So here we're just interpreting radar, or sorry, I think this is MODIS data. So we're just interpreting what that is as well. We want the Inuit to use any information at their fingertips to be able to create these community safety maps. So radar is going to be a big part of that, but other optical data is going to be important, like MODIS. Their own in situ observations as they're out in the ice is going to be really important. And then the traditional knowledge of the community is really important. That's why they have to do it. We can't, we can offer some information, but we can't put it all in the right context for them. So this is just out, my finger's pointing out in the ocean where we're standing. So we've got about a kilometer of ocean underneath us and a few inches of sea ice separating us from that. So we do really want to make sure that sea ice is safe. And that was about -40, which is Celsius, but also Fahrenheit. So, a lovely day out there, but pretty cool to do this work. And then interpreting radar. How do you interpret radar? We're building a lot of models to do that. So this is another physicalization that I've worked with the UOC. It's that to understand texture is such a difficult concept in radar. So here we've actually created something where they can feel the image as they're also looking at the monitor and seeing what the image is. And this worked great. You can see the smiles, like everybody really liked this. So we're continuing along these lines. Another thing is, how big is a pixel? So we were using fairly, we have a lot of area to cover, so fairly coarse imagery. And so this is the example of one of our pixels. And it was a true aha moment when they went, oh, all of this is like one value. Okay, now we get it. And it really helped in terms of understanding what kind of features that we could be mapping as well. And doing some interpretation exercises. I had to do those little squares because everybody kept interpreting the whole thing all of the time, and I just wanted to focus on what was the tone, what was the texture, and couldn't get everybody to stop from interpreting the whole scene. So I had to narrow their scope a little bit. There's a lot of teamwork, and this is where we're just starting some of the GIS work. One of the guides that I use, other than the actual Inuit principles and learning principles, and that's what the curriculum in Nunavut and Northwest Territories is actually based on, is the Inuit values. But I also look at the OECD, Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation. This is their learning framework 2030, and I find it really good because it goes beyond the skills and knowledge that are traditionally involved in a training program. But this is more. This is education. This includes values, attitudes, transformative competencies. So it really aligned with what was important to them, and that was, well, the fellow that you can see in the picture there. When I asked him what was important to him, he said, "Well, love," and I didn't expect that, but he said, "No, I do this for love." And I love my community, and I love trying to keep my community safe. And, that has just stuck with me. So whenever I think about moving forward and building that curriculum and the learning elements, I always think, love is part of this. We can't take that value away from them. We have to keep that at the core. Oh, and yeah, I had a little video to highlight those different parts there. We're also using all Inuit symbology. We have to use the Inuktitut symbols as well, and we can actually do that in ArcGIS, but we're using their symbols as well. So COVID has hit, and we're trying to do this kind of learning with Inuit, if you can imagine, remotely. I had probably $100,000 just to travel back and forth with up to the Arctic this year, and it's all useless. We can't get up there. They haven't had a COVID case in Nunavut, and they're keeping it that way, and they're keeping it that way by keeping everybody else out. So we don't know when we'll ever be able to get back up again. So we're trying to do a lot of work remotely, and the guys are getting pretty good on Zoom calls. I complimented one Inuit fellow on a presentation where I actually just got in today. And I said, "You did really well on that." And he said, "It's not my first rodeo." So they're getting used to Zooming and presenting and, just being in that virtual world as well. One thing that we're thinking, though, is how great to use virtual reality to learn about the different sea ice types, and then be able to look at, what does that look like on the image as you're looking out at the sea ice as well. I've been really getting into virtual reality. It just keeps pushing its way into my life. So I'm giving in. It's like I said, I don't think it's a fad. There's so many things you can do with it. It can be very, very simple just by using Google Cardboard, or it can be something really complex where you're getting into Oculus Quest and Rift. One of the key elements, motivations for using it is just to understand place. A friend of mine is an extreme caver. He studies the caves between the active volcanoes and the glacier. So Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, he does a lot of work in there. And so he came to my lab, I guess about a year ago, and said, let's look at some of the areas I'm going to, and I'll show you around. I said, sure. So we put on our goggles, went through Google Earth VR, and actually found some new cave entrances for him. The imagery was updated enough that it was relevant. And so when he went there a few months later, they actually were able to go to those new entrances to the caves and go down and do all of their research. And his paper just came out, and in the acknowledgements, I'm acknowledged for something like immersing him in virtual caves or something. It was pretty awesome, though. I haven't had an acknowledgement like that. So one of the groups I'm working with is NCGE, right? National Council for Geographic Education. And they've been collecting data while doing the Iceland field schools. And this is all about, getting educators to have a good geographic perspective and practice. So I'm working with a team there. We're called Geosagas, and we've expanded our reach. We're looking not only at Iceland, but of course, areas in Canada. So wherever I go now, I just bring a 3D camera with me, and I'm collecting data all of the time. I was just recently in Banff and Lake Louise and did some really cool glacial stuff. So wherever I go, I try and collect data. So in terms of teaching and reaching the public, this is really important. It's accessible. It can be affordable. You know, in terms of whether egalitarian, that it definitely ties in with the cost. But if you think about, you know, people going abroad for field schools, which I always, you know, I will never not support that. That's fabulous. But if you can't get there, right? If people can't get there, let's show them the place through VR and have them at least immersed. It is great experiential learning, learner driven. Again, that student agency, they can choose where to look and what to explore. And it's just around developing the right kind of resources in the VR and as supports. So this is a physical immersion room. I have the same kind of thing at my university, and I do a lot of my geomorphology labs in there. There's places, I tend to not be too worried about where I take students, but I am noticing they're getting more hesitant and more hesitant. And so there's some places I thought, okay, it's probably safer just to, let's try and do this in the immersion room and focus on the learning that I want them to do first. And then I'll take them out for the adventure after that and apply some more of that learning. So students are quite liking that. So here we're doing a little bit of stratigraphic mapping. And you can see, I mean, it is a vertical cliff. So yeah, they probably don't like it too much up there, but I was really able to get them engaged in the material because it was hands-on, even though it was a virtual environment. So this is why I'm thinking this is not a fad. This is something that really helps to engage students and increase their geographic literacy and abilities. Of course, we're getting a little more sophisticated. We've got gesture controls, and you can have pop-up information as well. So in our own platform, we're getting into machine learning, so we can understand. You know, what people are understanding, what they aren't understanding, what they're visiting, what they're not visiting, and try and facilitate the learning even better. Christopher, is that the 10 minutes?
That is the 10 minutes, ma'am. So I would like to move my cat first. Sorry. And open up my participants panel. We have 46 people in the room. So what I'm going to do is ask people to type their question into chat.
Okay.
Rather than have this kind of cat fight as we all try to stick our hand up. So with that, I will invite the audience to type a question in the chat. I'll then read it to Lynn and let her respond accordingly. And I'll prime the pump with a quick question.
Okay.
We're both North Americans, but Canada does a much better job at geographic education than we do, in my uninformed, biased, but I think correct view.
Is that your view? Or are you reading this, Christopher?
No, I'm just talking.
Okay.
This is my question. So do you have any hints for us? Any suggestions on how we can advance geographic literacy in the United States?
Okay. Yes. First of all, let's kind of situate that well. Some people think that, how do I word this? You know, when we look at the US with one lens, or we look at Canada with one lens, we get a certain picture. Canada is so absolutely diverse in terms of geographic education. Most people are familiar with Ontario, and Ontario actually has some geography courses for high school, leading into some really good university programs as well. And where I'm at in Alberta, we have nothing. We have nothing. We have no geo anything. We don't offer AP human geography. We don't do anything to do with geography. And so you've got quite a diversity there. So I'll just say that. So I can answer, well, I'll answer your question as, you know, we are facing the same thing. We will never have a national voice for curriculum. And that's just the way Canada's built. So we've got all the different jurisdictions, but not even Australia still has a national curriculum. And I think to look at how to improve geography education, you look to Australia right now. They are really engaging their industry associations. They have amazing events where they bring industry and educators of all levels together, and they have these big award ceremonies, and who's been bringing GIS into schools and who's making the most impact at these levels. It's absolutely fantastic how they're working together. They've also gone to the government to say, this is a critical area that we need to fill in the workforce. We need students who are able to, to do GIS, to understand spatial thinking, to look at spatial data science, right? That's the biggest, I think that's one of the biggest areas. Financial Post just came out with an article this morning about how there's going to be so much room in the spatial data science field. So that's the kind of thing where governments kind of go, oh, workforce, need to get students, curriculum. I honestly think that's the tie, is you always have to bring it to either what is the studying of geography going to do to improve outcomes typically in STEM disciplines, and how's it going to inform the workforce?
Thank you. Our next question is from Brad Hansen, one of the PhD students in our joint PhD program between UNM and NMSU. His question is quite simple, but challenging. How do you define good use of geography?
Good use of geography or geography tools?
Good use of geography. One of your slides noted something about a good use of geography or a tool.
I think use it for good. I think that was it, right? The superpowers. Use geography for good. Yeah, not nefarious purposes, because of course, location's really, really important for the bad guys as well as us. So personally, I think anything that we can do to help support, sort of nonprofits or communities that can get value from understanding spatial trends and patterns and information. That's what we have to do. That's what I mean by doing good. Has to make some improvement or help somebody.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry. I was just really curious about like how you defined good, like, because I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so you're saying it's just kind of open to anyone who has an NGO or a nonprofit. There's no focus or specific agenda that you see.
No, I think it was just more of a play on words on, like use your powers for good, not evil, just because I was talking about the superpowers, right? So it was really around that.
Well,
gotcha. I just think it's super important as far as how you define good and evil is not the same person to person.
You are completely correct. Yeah, and I just I wasn't very thoughtful in putting that in when, but I certainly will be.
Okay, we have another question up from Arthur Guerrero. A fellow classmate in a pedagogy class I take, his research question of, could explorations off the path into wild nature, inspiring entanglement rather than humanized nature simplification, create a potential in sowing the seeds of inspiration for young environmentalists? It's in your chat, Lynn. It's a somewhat extensive question. It's a great question, Arthur. It's a mouthful, so I'll let Lynn nibble on that a little bit.
I can't even say, let me grab my chat so I can see it.
So could explorations off the path into wild nature be more useful than a human nature simplification to create the inspiration for young environmentalists? So taking young people out to the woods and getting away from a human-centric viewpoint.
Yeah, I think, that's a really interesting question because it really ties into some of what we're learning around this spatial cognition too. So, sorry, I always go back to that. Yeah, absolutely. Let me just speak to the spatial cognition piece first, because I think it ties in. What we found is that even that sense of complex navigation that happens more in nature compared to human-built environments, right? There's just more subtle things. It's even around exercise, right? If you've ever heard any medical experts talking about what can you do to keep your brain active, and a lot of that is walking in nature as opposed to human built, because we have so many different things coming in, and you've got so many different pathways to navigate. I wouldn't be able to say why the answer would be no, or whether it would, you know, how would that not sow the seeds of inspiration for young environmentalists? Yeah, entanglement is really important, right? So complex problems and trying to root through those and find pathways. I think it serves in our mental and cognitive sense, but I think it serves, and this is where the inspiration would come from, in that kind of that's the soulful side as well.
Thank you. It's a little bit after 4, but we have one more question that I think is quite compelling. So I just ask people's patience for a few minutes. Camilio Calabasa, thank you for sharing your information. How are Indigenous communities being protected with their information in what seems like Indigenous geography? Or is the information not being protected?
Yeah, well, I can speak to, the kind of work that we're doing, and even that information with the Smart Boys, all the observations about the land that the Inuit are making in our in the Arctic communities. They deal with this application that I mentioned that's kind of like Facebook. It's called Siku. It was developed by Indigenous authors, and it's for Indigenous people, and it is all protected. You cannot get into that without permissions from the communities, and that was very important to them because they don't want, for hunting purposes, who do you want to know where you've seen bears? You want to show those for protection. You don't want necessarily people who aren't traditional hunters to come into that area. So they have been very protected in terms of that social media side. Beyond that, in terms of policy, I mean, these communities have been exploited for research for decades and decades, centuries, and only now are the policies coming into play. And I should mention, like Nunavut, Nunatsiavut, those are two of the areas that I work in. Those are Indigenous run. They can be considered Canadian, but it's the Inuit who run those lands and have all the policies. So they also have created specific research policies that researchers do follow. In terms of ethics, yeah, my university might ask for ethics, but for them, that doesn't mean anything. It's their, it's whether it's important for them and whether I will challenge any of their beliefs, right, or cross a line or be offensive in any way. That's the ethics I have to follow is theirs.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't
We're
the
now,
data? Oh, can I just answer that last one?
of course,
Data is not publicly available on ArcGIS Online. We don't. Everybody just uses. We're using ArcPro and ArcGIS, but not online. We're not sharing that in any terms of open data at all. That is kept within our group. What is shared publicly and with the communities is the actual interpretation of all that data. So what areas are safe, what's not safe, and that will be like printed out in a community and put on the door of the Hunters and Trappers Association and put in this app as well. So wherever the community wants that.
Excellent. It's 4:05. I would like to thank Lynn and invite anyone that wishes to do so to do the same in chat. Our custom would be to take you out to dinner and share some of our cultural geography of the valley with you, which is a very nice thing. But Mike notes that we will have you down and you've promised to come and see us. So we're going to hold you to it. Lynn, it was just a pleasure. You're a really compelling speaker that's done great work. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I didn't get to our the turkey little little story, but I will send you the story map of that. It's got the whole story on it, and it's how we engaged an entire city with GIS and remote sensing. So I will send you the link for that, and then someday I'll come down and give a talk on that.
Okay. And then we'll see that Michaela posts that to our Facebook page. Dan Dugas will put it up on the web. And with that, I just thank you very much again, Lynn. It's a wonderful way to end the week, and I wish you well. Be safe, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
I'll just keep the room open in case any
Sure.
of my peers have anything they want to share with me or anything with Lynn.
I do have something I'd like to share with Lynn.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm all right.
Good. Listen, wonderful talk as always. I just have a question for you.
Yeah, of course.
If I asked you to do a quick piece of a write-up of that thing where you were doing the virtual, you had that virtual environment for your physical geography students. If I could get you to do a quickie on that, would you do that for it's the geography teacher for a special issue?
Yeah, I'm just yes.
It wouldn't have to be long. It could be
Yeah.
literally it could be 750 words if you wanted.
Yeah. No, it's worked out so well, and is definitely the direction of my future labs for geomorphology.
Excellent. Well, we're doing a special issue. Rich Schultz, you remember Rich.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Rich Schultz and I are doing a special issue of the geography teacher on online pedagogy. And we wanted Mike Ritter to help us out with the physical geography thing, because he had that whole course doing really weird things. He's retired, and I mean really retired. he won't even answer our questions. So and I saw this thing and I freaked out. I was wondering if you'd be willing to do it. So I will be in touch afterwards.
All right. Yeah. Yeah,
Cool.
sounds good. We're actually putting the platform that we use for the Iceland learning. That should be coming out in Geography Teacher fairly shortly, actually.
Awesome. Awesome.
We want to be considerate of Lynn's time, but we have several
Oh, I'm
students in the room. If anyone would like to share a brief question with Lynn, that would be great. I have a 4:15 call I need to take, so we've got just a few minutes left, or I can hand the host role off to Mike and
Yeah.
we can see how long Lynn's willing to visit.
I'll
I'm
be glad
good.
to do that.
It's nice to talk to people.
If any of our other visitors would like to share a brief question with Lynn, please do.
Yeah, and please, because I didn't actually get to some of the more of the citizen science piece, and that's where all of that ends up leading to. So.
Did everyone go shy all of a sudden?
Oh. Well, can I tell you the story of the turkey for just a minute?
Of course.
So we had a rogue turkey in Calgary. You might know the famous Calgary Stampede. Well, he escaped from the stampede, and and he decided to live in a neighborhood, and he was playing in kids' soccer games, and he just became this ambassador for the city. And when COVID hit, he was the only one running around the city, and so he had a Facebook page of 6,000 followers, and said, well, I've seen him over here and I've seen him over here. And finally someone said, we need to make a map of his travels. So I went, okay, survey 1, 2, 3, story maps. We ended up getting hundreds of people collecting data on their phones and sending it in. The city of Calgary, all of their emergency response lines who had gotten calls about the turkey, they sent us all of their data. So we've put that on the map, and then more and more people were joining, and it became part of the whole story of the turkey and which neighborhoods he was in, and an untimely demise. Just a little bit before, but he'd made national news, and this whole, we protected his location. I always waited a couple of days before putting his most recent sighting on, and so the fact that he had his own, tracking, his own Turk tracker, that's what we called it. We were protecting his privacy. That was a pretty important story, apparently. So.
We may not resist the temptation to invite you back. You're a compelling, fascinating speaker. And I wish you would let folks from the US into Canada let's just hope soon that'll happen.
Mhm.
It'd be great to do that. Okay, with that, I'm going to close the room. I want to thank
All right.
everyone from coming. Special thanks to our speaker for visiting us virtually, and a special thanks to Mike for sending her our way. This was just great.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay,
Good
Governor
being able to
Moorman,
see you.
I'm going to sign off.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
everyone for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye.